Okay, let's get us to the physiology of muscle. Let's talk about what muscle does and how it does it. It has one main function that it actively does, and that is shortening, as contraction. We use that to create movement in the body, but also to hold our body in positions that we then can move from. So we hold our trunk up right, and so that's posture. We also use muscle to support soft tissues. For example, the stomach protects the gut on the underside. We also use muscle to regulate movement of stuff in and out of the body. We eat, and then the food moves through the body via muscle function, and we process the food, and then we excrete whatever we don't need. But that's muscle that does that movement through the body of the food. We can also generate heat with muscle. For example, when we shiver, that generates a lot of heat. A byproduct of muscle contraction is heat. When we look at what the characteristics of muscles are, what does muscle is excitable. So when we tickle it, it responds to a stimulus. So when a nerve talks to a muscle, it will respond and contract. And that's the other characteristic, is contractility. It has the ability to actively shorten. So it first gets triggered by a nerve, and then that causes on the inside small little protein threads, literally protein threads, that are along the length of the muscle, and they start sliding past another. Literally one pulls on the other one and gets the whole muscle shortened through that process. We'll talk a lot about that in a few minutes. And then muscle is extensible, so it can passively stretch and extend, and it has some elasticity to it. It has the ability to recoil and go back to a resting length. Looking at terminology, that's always helpful, because when you start reading stuff about a topic and they use all these fancy words, what you want to do is you want to slow down and take those words apart. And this muscle, when you see a prefix myo or misio, that refers to muscle. Sarco is also one that refers to muscle, but it means actually flesh. But that's when you look at the body, our flesh, so to speak, of a body is the muscle, really. We have multiple types of muscle. Look at that. We have three main types of muscle. We have the one that we talk about most of when we talk about it, is the skeletal muscle. And that mostly moves bones around. So that muscle is made of long cylindrical cells. They're long, skinny cells. You can sort of see that, long, skinny cells right here. That's a cell right here. It has multiple nucleuses, so it's multinucleated, and that's because the cell's so long, when it is made in embryonic stages, it is multiple cells that then fuse together, so the nucleus stays. Muscle contracts voluntarily. That means you're conscious, or we are conscious when we move it. When we contract it, you can, let's move that arm up, and you can contract it with your mind. It is when we look under the microscope, it looks striated. What that means is you see these two internal protein threads arranged, and it sort of looks like it's long lengthwise like that. And they are arranged lengthwise like that. But then we can also, it's hard to make out, but we can also see tiny little up and down lines that are in there too, reflecting an up and down perpendicular line. And those are anchoring places where these little protein threads are anchored, or at least one of the two different types. We'll talk about those two different types in a little bit. So that's skeletal muscle. And then we have, it looks pretty, yeah. And then we have cardiac muscle, and a cardiac muscle looks a little bit more random, and it's a little bit more branched looking. The cells do not fuse. There's one nucleus per cell, so they don't do that process. A heart muscle contracts involuntarily. It's unconscious. Well, thank the Lord. We don't have to think about that heart pumping. It does it on its own. It's still, though, when you go closer, you can see still as a striated look. It's parallel fibers with these discs in between, with these lines that go up and down. Now, the heart, though, also has a special feature, and that's an intercalated disc, and that's a combination of a gap junction and a desmosome. Remember, a desmosome holds the cells together really tight and strong, so instead of having these heart muscle cells fuse, they just have desmosomes holding the individual cells very strong together. That's great. But the other thing that we have in there is gap junctions. So there's little gaps, there's little channels that go from muscle to muscle. And through that, ions can go through. And a nerve impulse is carried when charged particles move. It's like electricity in the wall. Charged particles move from one area to another area across the membrane. And so we can let those particles go. And so a nerve impulse can sort of go through the whole heart muscle all at once through that process. But not via nerves carrying it to each individual cell, but the impulse goes actually through the muscle cells. And so that's very interesting. That's very good because that lets the heart contract as a unit, as just a one thing. And they call that a functional syncytium. We'll get to that when we get to the heart muscle itself. That's the next part of the class. And then, so these are really cool. And then we got smooth muscle, and smooth muscles are the walls of hollow organs or of tubes. These are different looking. They look like spindles. They like have a tip, and then they get wider with a nucleus in the middle, and then a tip. More like a typical kind of cell thing. Also involuntary. This is the stuff that moves your food around in this, from the top to the bottom. When your stomach growls, that's what's talking to you. That's those muscles. It's non-striated looking. It's when we look at microscopically, so it's still parallel fibers, but they're different. When they contract, it's like slow contraction. They're regular. They're sort of wave pattern. That's that peristalsis. When you have food particles move through your system, it's often wave patterns, especially if it's actually goes towards the end of it and you have to go to the bathroom. All of a sudden, you have to go. That's a whole wave that moves material forward. And these muscle cells can also sustain contraction for a long period of time, and that's a good thing too. Okay, let's go to the next.